I never thought I'd be treated like a criminal in my own home, but that's exactly what happened the night 4 men stormed into my garage. Their black vests carried cheap white letters spelling out HOA cop, like some discount version of authority. Before I could even open my mouth, cold steel clamped around my wrists. They shoved me hard into my workbench, tools rattling from the pegboard and clattering onto the floor. One pressed his weight down on my shoulder while another barked nonsense about Section 14 of the bylaws. None of it was legal. None of it was real. They didn't read me rights, they didn't show proper ID, they just smirked like bullies who'd done this before. The leader leaned in close, his voice dripping with arrogance. Comply, or you're out. What he didn't realize. I'd been in tighter spots, and this time, they had chosen the wrong garage. When I moved into Cedar Ridge, I thought I was stepping into a quiet, well-kept neighborhood. The houses lined up neatly like postcards, lawns trimmed to perfection, and every driveway clean enough to pass a military inspection. But behind that order was a woman who thrived on control, Patricia Moreland, the HOA president. From the very first week, I knew she had a problem with me. The way her eyes narrowed when I parked my truck a little crooked. The way she made a note when my daughter left her bike leaning against the fence. It wasn't just neighborly observation, it was surveillance. She wanted obedience, and I had no intention of bowing. The first letter slid under my door only 3 days after moving in. Violation: trash bins not stored properly. Except they were neatly lined against the side of my house. I ignored it, thinking it was some clerical mistake. Then came another violation: lawn edging inconsistent. I almost laughed. My grass hadn't even grown enough to edge. That's when I realized these weren't mistakes. They were tests. Patricia was probing, trying to see if I would pay up quietly like everyone else. I started asking questions. What bylaws gave her authority? Where were the official records? Who oversaw the fines she issued? The answers were always the same, vague references to section this or article that. None of it made sense. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Neighbors whispered about outrageous fees, about liens slapped on homes over minor infractions. Some had even paid thousands just to keep their families out of court. Patricia ruled with fear. So I made a choice. At the next community meeting, I stood up and told the truth. These citations are bogus, I said. None of this would hold up in real court. Don't pay a dime until you've seen proof. For the first time, people looked at Patricia differently. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into questions. A few brave neighbors refused to pay, others filed appeals. The fear started cracking. Patricia noticed. Her smile grew tighter. Her letters sharper. The fines came faster now, one after another. She wanted to bury me in paper and intimidation. But every letter she sent, I photographed, cataloged, and dissected. And every time I showed a neighbor the truth, her grip slipped a little more. To Patricia, I wasn't just another resident anymore. I was a threat. And threats had to be dealt with. The harassment didn't stop with letters. Soon, it grew into something darker, something designed to wear me down. At first it was notes taped to my door, anonymous scribbles about being a bad neighbor or a troublemaker. Then came the fake violations, more ridiculous each time. Garage door nonconformity. Mailbox not HOA-approved shade of beige. I kept the papers, all of them, but the sheer relentlessness started to grate. Then strangers started appearing. Not board members. Not neighbors. Outsiders. They weren't dressed like police, but they carried themselves like men used to giving orders. Dark SUVs with tinted windows crept past my house. Sometimes they idled at the curb for 20 minutes, no plates I recognized, just engines humming. Once, I stepped outside and saw 3 men leaning against the hood of a truck down the street, black vests strapped tight across their chests. Stenciled across the back, in bold white letters, HOA cop. The first time I saw it, I almost laughed. It was absurd. But absurdity doesn't feel funny when it lingers. They cruised by again the next night. Then the next. They never came close, but they wanted me to see them. Intimidation dressed up as authority. I confronted Patricia directly. "What game are you playing?" I asked at her office. She gave me that smug smile and said, "Cedar Ridge has rules. Some residents need firmer reminders than others." That was the moment I knew. She wasn't bluffing. She had built her own little private army, men she could call at will to enforce whatever fiction she dreamed up. Not law, not justice, just power. I doubled down. I kept warning neighbors, kept exposing her frauds. Some thanked me, some stayed scared. But Patricia grew bolder. One morning, my daughter found our mailbox door ripped off its hinges. Another day, I came home to find "pay up" scrawled in chalk on my driveway. The police reports went nowhere. "Probably kids," they said. "We'll keep an eye out." But I knew better. Then came the threats in person. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway, an SUV rolled to a stop behind me, boxing me in. A man in a vest leaned out the window. "The president doesn't like troublemakers," he said flatly. "Consider this your warning." Then they drove off. No license plate I could catch. My wife was scared. My daughter couldn't sleep. And every night, the black vests loitered somewhere nearby. Patricia thought she was winning. She thought the fear would break me like it had broken everyone else. But fear doesn't break a man who's seen worse. I'd faced threats with higher stakes, men with more dangerous intentions. I knew intimidation when I saw it, and I knew that one day, they'd step over the line. That night came faster than I expected. It was a quiet evening when it happened. I stepped into the garage to lock up, the air smelling faintly of oil and metal. The click of the latch was still in my hand when the side door slammed open with a thunderous crack. 4 men poured in like a wave, black vests gleaming under the single hanging bulb. Before I could react, a hand clamped around my arm and wrenched it behind my back. Another shoved me chest first into my workbench. Tools rattled off the pegboard, clattering across the concrete. Cold metal bit into my wrists, cuffs, fastened tight and fast. "You're being detained under Cedar Ridge bylaws, Section 14, one barked, his tone rehearsed but hollow. It was nonsense, and we all knew it. But they didn't care. They thought the vest and the cuffs were enough to make it real. The leader leaned close, breath sour with arrogance. "The president wants you to understand. You either comply, or you're out. Consider this your last warning." They smirked like it was routine, like they'd done it before. They thought my garage was their arena. What they didn't know was that I'd been in tighter spots, with less room, and I'd never once folded. I stayed compact, shoulders pinned, wrists locked behind me. Training isn't about fancy moves, it's about mindset. They assumed cuffs meant helplessness. They hadn't calculated for leverage. The first one came close, maybe to gloat. That was his mistake. I planted my feet, shifted my weight, and snapped my hip sideways. Not a kick, just raw momentum. His balance faltered. As he stumbled, I hooked his ankle with my cuffed hands and yanked hard. His body toppled forward, crashing into the toolbox. The clang of metal filled the garage. Surprise is a weapon people forget to respect. It bought me a second, and a second is all I needed. I twisted, forcing my shoulders against the edge of the bench to pry space, enough to torque. My cuffed hands hooked around the nearest attacker's forearm, dragging him close. My shoulder dropped into his chest, sending him staggering. Another lunged. I hooked his leg with my foot, swept it out, and he went crashing to the floor. Oil slick smeared his back as he tried to scramble up. No time for theatrics. Every move was ugly, close, efficient. Knee into thigh. Elbow across collarbone. Palm into jaw. Short, brutal, decisive. The cuffs hurt, bit deeper with every strike, but pain is just a signal. I used the garage itself, bench edges, pipes, even the concrete, to turn the environment into a weapon. Two down, groaning. The other two regrouped, but too late. One swung clumsily, and my shoulder dropped under the arc. I drove forward, carrying his weight into the wall. The last man tried to circle, but my cuffed hands hooked his ankle again. Down he went, crashing hard. Breathing heavy, heart steady, I stood in the middle of the chaos. For men groaning on my floor, their vests smeared with dust and oil. My wrists ached, but I was still standing. That's when I heard it. A neighbor shouting from the street. "I'm calling the cops." Panic flickered across their faces. For the first time, they realized this wasn't going their way. The leader scrambled up, face flushed with anger. He lunged at me, desperation plain in his eyes. I turned sharply, my elbow connecting with his chin. He dropped like a sack of bricks, sprawled against the floor. The other three shifted, fear mixing with confusion. They weren't trained for this. They expected compliance, not resistance. Outside, more voices rose. Flashlights flickered through the windows. Phones out, cameras rolling. They forced their way in, someone shouted. I took a steady breath, bent forward, and pulled my wallet free with my chin. It wasn't easy, but I flipped it open. The badge inside gleamed under the porch light seeping in through the cracked garage door. "I'm a U.S. Marshal," I said, my voice low but steady. "You're under arrest for impersonating an officer and committing burglary. Stay where you are." For the first time since they barged in, their smirks froze. Their eyes darted toward each other, searching for a plan. But no plan came. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Red and blue lights cut through the night, painting the walls in fractured color. The leader opened his mouth to protest, but the words died as deputies stormed up the driveway. "Get those restraints off him," the lead deputy barked after checking my badge. The cuffs clicked free, and blood surged back into my wrists. I flexed my fingers, steady and calm, even as the four imposters were lined against the wall, cuffed properly this time. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. The leader scrambled up, face flushed with anger. He lunged at me, desperation plain in his eyes. I turned sharply, my elbow connecting with his chin. He dropped like a sack of bricks, sprawled against the floor. The other three shifted, fear mixing with confusion. They weren't trained for this. They expected compliance, not resistance. Outside, more voices rose. Flashlights flickered through the windows. Phones out, cameras rolling. They forced their way in, someone shouted. I took a steady breath, bent forward, and pulled my wallet free with my chin. It wasn't easy, but I flipped it open. The badge inside gleamed under the porch light seeping in through the cracked garage door. "I'm a U.S. Marshal," I said, my voice low but steady. "You're under arrest for impersonating an officer and committing burglary. Stay where you are." For the first time since they barged in, their smirks froze. Their eyes darted toward each other, searching for a plan. But no plan came. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Red and blue lights cut through the night, painting the walls in fractured color. The leader opened his mouth to protest, but the words died as deputies stormed up the driveway. "Get those restraints off him," the lead deputy barked after checking my badge. The cuffs clicked free, and blood surged back into my wrists. I flexed my fingers, steady and calm, even as the four imposters were lined against the wall, cuffed properly this time. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. Resolution, 400 words. The deputies didn't waste time. Phones were pulled, pockets searched. Inside those devices were the smoking guns, text messages straight from Patricia Moreland herself. "Make sure he's humiliated. Cuff him if you have to. He won't fight back if you look official." Another read, "Once he's dealt with, the others will fall in line. Collect the fines." The deputies' faces hardened. These weren't random thugs, they were hired muscle, carrying out orders directly from the HOA president. Neighbors gathered in the street, murmurs turning to outrage as evidence came to light. Some pointed at the imposters, others shook their heads in disbelief. A few came forward, showing receipts of fines they'd paid under Patricia's threats. Thousands of dollars, drained from hard-working families, funneled into her pocket. One deputy summed it up perfectly as he flipped through the so-called bylaws binder the imposters carried. "These aren't rules," he muttered. "These are invoices." By the end of the night, Patricia was in handcuffs too, her phone lighting up with messages that betrayed her schemes. Court moved fast once the evidence stacked up. Patricia Moreland tried every excuse, claimed the men acted alone, claimed the messages were fabricated. None of it held. The judge's words cut sharp: an HOA is not a government. You are not law enforcement. You abused trust and authority for profit, and you endangered a federal officer. The sentences were heavy. Patricia, 7 years in state prison, $350,000 restitution, permanently barred from serving on any board. The hired HOA cops each pled guilty to felonies, unlawful restraint, impersonation, assault, and walked away with criminal records, probation, and fines. The county dissolved the HOA entirely. A receiver stepped in to manage the neighborhood. For the first time in years, residents could breathe without fear of fines taped to their doors. As for me, I looked around Cedar Ridge, quiet at last, and thought of the night in my garage. They tried to make me a prisoner in my own home. Instead, they signed their own sentences.